Audio Janda. Audio Jungle.
Can you give us a little bit of a background of who you work for and what you did?
Yeah, we can. And what I'd like to do before we start is it's a quick little disclaimer statement here. I always quote the 1982 Intelligence Identities Protection Act. That's the IIPA, which is U.S. Code Title 50, Sections 421 and 426. And it states the disclosure of a U.S. government operative's identity is illegal only if it is done intentionally and with knowledge that the government is still actively maintaining a cover for such operative. And that's, because of the John Kiriakou case, the CIA case officer back in January 2013, he was sentenced to 30 months in federal prison for violating this act. He inadvertently named a CIA officer who was involved in the CIA's RDI program, which was a rendition, detention, and interrogation program. So the names we use will be non-active personnel or deceased personnel, and so we always just state that, as a little caveat before we go. But my background, I started back in 1974. I graduated from high school in Dallas, Texas, and I had scored on the top of 1% of the SAT test in physics. And so I had a full tennis scholarship to college. And in 1975, at the physics department of East Texas State University, CIA came to recruit me there. And I turned down recruitment with them at that time. And then you fast forward later on, I started college, finished college, and graduated with a double Bachelor of Science degree in both mathematics and physics. And then began working on my Master of Science degree at Stephen F. Austin State University in Nacogdoches, Texas. And from there went to Chevron, and then up to Amoco Production Company. I was a petroleum geophysicist in Tulsa. And that was in Tulsa, Oklahoma. That's the early 1980s. And during this whole time, we had been involved in some black ops as a private contractor. And in 82, 83, 84, 85, right in that time frame, we were involved in the operations over in Arkansas, centered around the main airport there with Bill and Hillary Clinton, and that was CI Operation Centaur Rose. We can talk about that later, arming the Contras down in Nicaragua and that regional conflict down there with the Sandinistas. And so after all that, later on, one of the things I was hired to do was bodyguard Staff Sergeant Barry Sadler down in Guatemala. He had been in Vietnam and been wounded in Pleiku, and then he had written the Ballad of the Green Beret in '65. It was the #1 hit single here in the States. And that story's in the book. It's never been told before, what really happened down there. And then you go on through the Waco thing in April of '93. That's when Waco ended. It began in February 28th of '93. And we have some stories in there that have never been told public about what really happened with Timothy McVeigh and the real situation there at Waco. And fast forward on through in '91, and September 18th to the 22nd, I died twice in the hospital. I was targeted for assassination in Project Slammer. We can talk about that operation later. And then so in '94, I was beginning to get operationally ineffective. I'd been injured severely. I was drinking a lot to cover my PTSD and stuff. And then I was offered the job to bomb the Murrah building in April. It went off in April 19th of '95. And in October of '94, I was offered the job to bomb that building. And we can talk about all that later. There's a lot to that. And so I'm just fast forwarding up to a point. After that, of course, the Murrah building was bombed, and McVeigh and them were sentenced. And in 1997, I was up here in Colorado, and I was the biggest machine gun dealer in the state of Colorado, machine guns and silencers at the time. That was a front for more covert ops. But there was an operation here, an ATF DEA operation called Operation Stingray. And in that operation, I met who would later be the nation's top cop. His name was Blake L. Butler. He was an ATF agent, and I found out that he was at the Murrah building the day it was bombed, but had not showed up for work mysteriously. He was also at the Waco Branch Davidian compound the day it was the shootout happened there, and he was also, Dave, up there at Ruby Ridge, Idaho. And so the same players are starting to show up. So in the 2 years that ATF DEA Operation Stingray was going on, in April the 20th of 1999, the Columbine High School shootings happened here in Littleton, Colorado. And at that time, Dave, it was the biggest, worst mass high school shooting in U.S. history. And so 2 days later, I was at ATF agent Butler's undercover residence. He was given his nation's top cop award by Vice President Al Gore and Janet Reno, U.S. Attorney General, a little bit later after this. But on April the 22nd, we were sitting around there talking, and Bill Clinton and Janet Reno were on the TV. They'd come after the Columbine carnage, and of course we're capitalizing on the Democrats' gun control agenda. And so I began talking, and we were talking about them, and I began telling Agent Butler all the stories about Black Ops and CI Operation Centaur Rose, Jade Bridge, Screwworm, several others, all kinds of things about the pedophile rings in Arkansas, the drugs, the cocaine, the arms to Nicaragua, the Clintons, the cover-up, the money laundering, and so forth. So I didn't know that we were on tape. We had 2 4mm hidden cameras, the ATF and DEA did. And so what they did was, all this stuff that I said was true, and they sealed it all up and disappeared the tapes. And then ATF agent Butler planted me with false evidence. And we can talk about all that later, but he planted me with false evidence, and then they indicted me. And October 7th of 99, they arrested me, and the CIA picked me up first and asked me direct questions about Bill Clinton and a bunch of stuff, turned me over to the ATF, DEA, and FBI down at the Colorado Springs Airport. And then they put me in front of Judge Edward Nottingham in the 10th Circuit Court. And Judge Edward Nottingham, we would find out later, was directly nominated for his position by ex-DCI, that's the ex-Director of Central Intelligence, George Bush Sr., back in the late 70s. That's when they came to recruit me. Well, I would find out later that the prosecutor on our case was the U.S. Attorney, Tom Strickland. And Tom Strickland, he was appointed directly to his position by none other than Bill Clinton. And we found out that when Bill Clinton first came up from Arkansas and he became president, he fired every U.S. attorney in the whole country. It was about 93 of them, I think it was. And Tom Strickland was one of the ones he appointed. And so my case was already being fixed by the CIA covertly. And we would find out that Tom Strickland, before he was U.S. Attorney for the 10th Circuit, and Clinton appointed him, he was in a law firm in Denver, Norman Brownstein, Hyatt, and Faber. And Norman Brownstein was on the Council of Six. That's a CIA group of attorneys back in the 70s with George Bush. And so this whole thing started getting very skewed, which is one reason McVeigh and the whole Oklahoma City cover-up trial was sent up there. It's a place where CIA could control it all. So to make a long story short, they threw me in there and denied my bond with a perfect record, not one traffic ticket, no drugs, no violence. They ordered me to go to the SHU, which is a special housing unit. It's like a supermax security where McVeigh had stayed. And we can talk about all that story and his execution, and because we know some people that eyewitnessed that execution up at the Terre Haute FCI, the Federal Correctional Institute. And so anyway, I'd been in there for a while without bond, and on July 24th of 2003, Judge Nottingham Birmingham ordered a final hearing, and we had hired a tape expert named William Valentine, and he had also once previously worked for CIA. His job was to debug the White House electronically, and he had coffee in the Oval Office with 3 sitting presidents, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton. And so he was a real good expert, and we had at this point uncovered legal evidence to a legal standard that the ATF and DEA planted evidence, and CIA had doctored tapes and withheld tapes and so forth, and we had them all on perjury and obstruction and all kinds of stuff. And so when this hearing was ordered, July 24, 2003, we were going to get all this stuff into court. And we had enough evidence to take down the entire ATF DEA offices in the Springs and Colorado Springs. And so 2 weeks before that, on July 7th of 2003, I'm cleaning my windshield on my LTD in the Walmart parking lot on 8th Street in Colorado Springs, and I'm about to go, get all this stuff into court. And I never heard it or saw it, but I heard the motor rev and the tire squeal, and I was leaning across my hood cleaning the windshield, and the parking place in front of me was open, and this car came in there and completely totaled my LTD Crown Victoria out from under me and knocked it about 8 feet back, knocked me back into another car. I rolled over, it hit a fender, bounced off, hit a concrete light pole, and I was almost killed. And so time went by in the hospital, and I got out and was in an outpatient physical therapy facility. And I was leaving that. It was only just a couple of days before this big hearing. And I was walking out to my other car, and sitting in the parking lot, on the road out by the parking lot, was a Colorado Springs police cruiser with the motor running. And when I got around to my car, they floored the motor and jumped the curb and came at me, throwing sparks and stuff everywhere, and then swerved. I thought they were going to crush me between the cars again, and the car swerved, and in the driver's side, wearing a Colorado Springs police uniform, was the nation's top cop, Blake L. Butler. And he pointed at me and shook his finger at me. He's about 4 feet away. And then he floored the car and took off. And so I was pretty shooken up, and I drove back home up in the mountains. I stopped and threw up for a while, and I was in pretty bad shape. And I got home here. Now, this is just a couple of days before this big hearing where we're going to expose all the CIA corruption, 10th Circuit corruption, ATF, DEA, evidence planning, all of it. And I'm sitting here watching a movie with my wife and young son. And I look out, and up in the front yard pulls an SUV. And in it is Harold Leonard, the guy that offered me the job to blow up the Murrah building for $1 million back in October '94. And I thought they were going to kill me, so I just went out there. And I didn't want my son to see his dad getting shot, at that young age. So I went out there, and Harold Leonard was sitting there. And he said, look, if you go to that court hearing and talk and say anything about the Oklahoma City bombing, or any of the black ops we did or anything, we've been ordered to kill you. And we've got orders to kill your wife and kid. And he pointed up at the house. And I worked with this guy. I mean, he was my friend. He was one of my trusted companions. And then he put his head on the steering wheel and sighed, and he looked at me and said, it's nothing personal. And so the next day, I called my attorney, which was Harvey Steinberg, the Denver Broncos football team attorney at the time. And I told him that I wanted to change the plea, and we went up to the 10th Circuit Federal Court in Denver, and we met United States Assistant Attorney Greg Goldberg, who was then on the case. And I said, I'll plead guilty to anything you guys want. And he said, pick a charge, any charge, I don't care which one, plead guilty and you're out of here. And so I pled guilty to something I didn't even know what it was. It turned out to be dealing firearms without a license, really stupid stuff. But it got the CIA off my back. And I waited all this time. It's been 22 years since I was first offered that job to bomb the Murrah building, over 22 years. And I waited all this time for Bill Clinton to get out of the office of presidency and Hillary Clinton to get out as Secretary of State and all the stuff she was in. And so I've stepped forward at this time and wrote the book about all this called Choosing the Light, Dark Secrets of the Oklahoma City Bombing. And all these stories are detailed in high-level detail with a whole lot of information. We have over 20,000 pages of court and discovery evidence. We have tapes that I made, my own tapes. We snuck surveillance equipment inside the U.S. Attorney's office and I tape recorded them in there. And I wrote them letters accusing President Bill Clinton of being a drug dealer for the CIA and all kinds of stuff. And all the stuff's in the book. It's about 700 pages long. So that's a basic overview of all this. And then with the funny part, Dave, after all this was done, and all this high-level corruption and evidence planning and corruption in the DOJ, the funny thing, Dave, is in 2007, Judge Nottingham himself, he had to resign in a sex scandal with prostitutes. He was the highest-ranking federal judge in Colorado, and he was in a prostitute scandal with Denver Players owner Brenda Stewart. And all this came out in a divorce hearing, so the judge had to resign. So the judge was corrupt, the U.S. attorney was corrupt. All of this was cover-up for the Clintons and the Murrah bombing and the real reasons why it was really bombed. And so this is a big thing, and that's a basic overview of what's in this book.
So let's go back a little bit and let's talk about the Oklahoma City bombing when these individuals approached you to bomb the building. What actually happened? Did they offer you money right at the start of it? Did they give you the equipment? Why did they want you to do it? And what did they want you to do?
Right, yeah. In October 94, Harold Leonard called me, and he'd been a contractor for CIA. And we met at a rural location out in the mountains. Under the tree canopy, they're always worried about satellites and surveillance and all this stuff. And we'd done several jobs with Harold before. And when we were there, he said, well, we got another job for you. And I said, okay. Where is it? And he said, it's here in the States. And I thought we were going overseas. We had previous jobs in Saudi Arabia over there offered to us. And he said, no, this one's here in the States. And I said, well, what kind of job is it? He said, it's an EOD, explosives job. And I said, what's the target? And he said, it's a building. I said, what kind of building? He said, federal building. And I said, what? And he pointed to a backpack he had laying there. It was a purple and black backpack. It had $500,000 in cash in it, in U.S. currency. And he said, well, we're going to give you $500,000 now and $500,000 when the job's done. You can have your choice of a standard DOD team or whatever materials you need. And I said, whoa, wait a minute. What is this? It's a federal building? I said, which one? And he said, it's the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. And I was at the end of my operational usage anyway. I had severe PTSD. I'd been injured a lot, several broken ribs and head injuries and all kinds of stuff. And I was having real bad PTSD dreams every night and couldn't sleep. And I just went off on Harold and told him, look, I've got to quit. I can't take this stuff anymore. And I said, you guys have went too far. This is our own country. These are our own people. And there's no way I'm doing this. I don't mind going overseas and doing stuff, but I will not do this. And so he calmed me down and everything. But the reasons why they wanted this bombed, I didn't know them at the time. I turned this job down, and that was about 6 months before it actually went up. But the real reasons why the bombing happened, there were really two basic reasons, and they had to do with record storage and destroying records, one of which dealt with the Clintons down in Arkansas when they were running those CIA ops down there, Centaur Rose, Jade Bridge, and Screwworm. The ABI, Arkansas Bureau of Investigation, DEA, IRS, had began to investigate that all down there because at the Mena Airport, there was a front company for CIA called Rich Mountain Aviation and a contract CIA pilot named Barry, been in the 20th Special Forces Group in '63 back in Fort Bragg, and they had gone over to Vietnam and done their stuff over there. The other guys I knew, and they were running a lot of arms down there to Central America and bringing drugs back to pay for it, because back in 1984 they had the Bolin Amendment passed in Congress, and President Reagan at the time went around Congress. The Bolin Amendment forbade us to put U.S. troops down there in Central America, and the Russians were really supplying that Daniel Ortega guy. He was the president of the communist Sandinistas, and Reagan didn't want the balance of power to be disturbed. So we began supporting the Congress against the Sandinistas. And Congress wouldn't let him do what he wanted, so he went around and ordered CIA director to arm them. And so they created these black ops. And Centaur Rose was the op I was in, which is an arms and drug op. And then the other ops were Jade Bridge and Screwworm. Jade Bridge was an op where they were bringing Nicaraguan pilots up here in Arkansas, and they were training them to fly light aircraft. And then the Screwworm part of it was down centered around Mexico City, which was a manufacturing op to produce automatic weapons and stuff like that. And so all that had been going on down there, and it's detailed highly in the book, and the stuff we did and how we moved the arms and all the stuff we did. Meanwhile, I was using my front as a petroleum geophysicist with Amoco as a perfect civilian cover. And the CIA calls that a NOC, a non-official cover. And so all that was going on, and they were washing a lot of money, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of cocaine money through the banks, the Worthington Bank, BCCI. Anyway, all of this stuff was going on, and there was a lot of law enforcement records being stored. Stuff of the Rose Law Firm, the Whitewater Scandal, Jim and Susan McDougal. All these records were stored at the Little Rock FBI field office. And so just prior to the Murrah Building bombing, these records were moved over there to the Murrah Building, where they were supposed to be destroyed in the blast. And then the second thing, the bigger reason why the Murrah Building was to be destroyed and destroy all the records. For this, this is all detailed highly in the book with the dates, names, times, everything. But to make a long story short, we have to go back a little bit into history. In the 1980s, Saddam Hussein was a paid CIA asset, just like in Panama with Noriega. He was also a paid CIA asset. A lot of people don't know that. But Saddam had gained power in the Ba'ath Party and was controlling Iraq, and then got in a war with Iran in the 1980s. And the Iran-Contra scandal, a lot of people know about that. The two basic things that happened was we covertly armed Saddam because Iran had a 10-to-1 infantry advantage over Iraq. And we didn't want our ally overrun. And Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense at the time, was giving satellite intel to Saddam and so forth. And the other thing we did was covertly arm him with copies of the Hawkeye 123 cluster bomb. The CIA took the microfilm patented, plans for that thing and took it down to Argentina, set up a front company. And they had to get zirconium out of the U.S., which is on the import-export restriction list. And they faked it through the Agricultural Department. All the dates, times, names of how they did this is all in this book. But to make a long story short, they set up a fake arms company and gave him these cluster bombs. They moved them through North Africa into Iraq, and this was in case he was overrun, because these things are really good at killing mass troop numbers on the ground. The other thing they did was give him the AIM strain of anthrax, which was a weaponized grade of anthrax produced at Fort Detrick, Maryland. And this particular type of anthrax has a smaller a smaller size, spore size, and an altered protein coat, which makes it it can be uptaked more readily in human targets, hence the weaponized version. And so this was all covert. The American people didn't know about all this. And what happened was when the war was over between Iran and Iraq, Saddam then invaded Kuwait later, and it really scared the Saudis. And they put pressure on our government. And so we cooked up the Desert Storm invasion to throw Saddam out of Kuwait. But we had a problem. The Pentagon had a big problem. Number one, this anthrax stuff was all hidden and unknown. And we were afraid that our former ally, Saddam, who had now been turned, from an asset to a liability, would use this stuff on our own troops. And our standard anthrax vaccinations, the course was 1 month for 6 months to build immunity. So it took 6 months. And our troops, we didn't have time. And so they cooked up a brand new anthrax vaccine with an adjunct called squalene. It's a long molecular fatty acid group. It's a shark oil, which boosts autoimmune function like aluminum in vaccines or mercury in the vaccines. And so to make a long story short, we're getting to the Murrah building here. They bypassed FDA testing. They gave our guys this stuff. All this is detailed in the book from Dover Air Force Base and all the stuff up there. And it caused what's later to be called the Gulf War syndrome. Another thing, it made our guys sick, basically, and it made the shots down for 1 shot to 1 month so they could hurry up and get everybody over there. And they basically used our troops as guinea pigs without their knowledge. The second thing that they used was depleted uranium. That Gulf War in January 91 was the first time the Pentagon ever used on a mass scale depleted uranium weapons. Their two primary delivery systems were the A-10 Warthog jet aircraft that used a 30-millimeter chain gun. I know some of the pilots that use that over there. And then the M1A1 Abrams tanks, like Timothy McVeigh and his platoon commander, Terry Nichols, used. They had a sabot round in them that had the DU. And so to make a long story short, these had enough kinetic energy to blow a Soviet T-54 turret clean up in the air like a tumbleweed. Those things weigh 11 tons. And these things had such high kinetic energy, approximately 5,200 feet per second velocity, that they made these new fireballs. And the fireballs, Dave, created new compounds out of uranium. They were uranium oxide, uranium dioxide. This stuff was mildly radioactive, and the micron size of the particulates in these explosions was about 4 microns. But the Pentagon had issued our troops MOP gear that went only down to 10 microns. The filters wouldn't filter all this smaller stuff. So our troops started breathing it, and it concentrates in the thyroids and the reproductive glands. And so if you're a man, you breathe that stuff, and you were getting low-level radiation in your thyroids and in your testicles. So after Desert Storm, all our troops were coming back. There's approximately 480,000 of them. And they came back to the States and started, making love to their wives and stuff. And this low-level radiation that had been absorbed in the reproductive, it was being passed on to the spouses, and from the spouses to the children, and from the children to the grandchildren, and so forth. And the Pentagon had a brand new problem, just like the Agent Orange scandal of our troops from Vietnam. There was all this long-term, low-level radiation stuff that could have went on multi-generationally. The Pentagon did not know how many generations down that they would have medical culpability. This could have turned into hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars. And so we're getting to the Murrah building now, the real reasons they blew it up. Senator Chris Shays, a Republican from Connecticut, was sitting on an Armed Services Committee back in '94. That's the same year I was offered the job to bomb the Murrah building. And he was determined to get medical culpability and medical money for all these sick Gulf War syndrome. The VA was full of people that were sick with all of this stuff from the vaccines and the radiation. So he tasked the FBI with collecting all the medical records of 480,000 troops. And it was a nightmare. Some of them were still in the Army, some of them weren't. These records were everywhere, and the FBI went around gathering all these medical records so they could have a big hearing and dole out billions of dollars in medical payments. And guess where they were all stored? In the Murrah building. And so when all of that went up, the medical culpability payments and the Gulf War syndrome and all that stuff went away, because if you don't have the medical records, you can't prove medical culpability. And so later on, it was September 19th of 1996. Now, the Murrah building went up April 19th of 95. And so in September of 96, they were still having congressional hearings on Gulf War syndrome. And at those hearings, the DOD admitted, and we have a copy of their of the stuff from the hearings in the appendix of the book, but the DOD admitted that there were over 400,000 Gulf War syndrome medical records had, quote, disappeared. And that was after the Murrah building went up. So those are the two basic reasons for the destruction there in that building. And, McVeigh was, of course, Apache. I knew when Harold Leonard offered me a job like that, I was getting to the end of my operational usefulness, and I figured, they were going to kill two birds with one stone. It's a good way to get rid of me and shut me up for all the stuff I know, and then have Apache. I knew it was Apache op. I've been around too long, and especially for $1 million, that's a real low-level amount of money for something like that. So McVeigh was the Apache later with the Ryder truck. That was the cover for what the real Black Op was, and the real Black Op was destroying all the records.
Now, with you knowing all this knowledge, they just let you walk away? Did they try to silence you? What?
No, at the point when Harold Leonard offered me that job in October '94, I turned from a CI asset to a liability. And the very next day, one of my handlers, I can say his name now because he's deceased. His name was Duke Flaglier, and he had done 2 tours in Vietnam and the Special Forces. And then when he got out of the Army, he had accepted recruitment by CIA, and he was one of my handlers. He called me the next day after I turned that job down, and he said, you need to leave the country. And I said, why? And he said, well, I heard, what's going on. And he had a place in Belize, and he offered me the keys to that, and he said, we'll stage you out of Belize. Just go down there, and then we'll get you somewhere. And I said, why? I said, I'm not going to say anything. You know me, He said, no. He said, you know too much. You're now a liability. And I at the time, I told him, I said, no, I'm retired, and I'm not going to talk or anything like that. So I stayed here in the States. And then after the building did go up, I didn't know when or where that was going to happen, but when it did, I immediately went black. And, we had fake IDs and passports and disguises and all the standard tradecraft stuff. And I went down to Oklahoma and staged out of some of the safe houses we'd been using between Tulsa and Oklahoma City during the Centaur Rose ops that were, back in the 80s in Arkansas. And then I left the country briefly and then came back up to the States. But I just left it with that, that I'm quitting and I'm getting out, and I wasn't going to talk.
Now, you mentioned Waco, and I noticed that they're putting on like a little mini-series about Waco. Why now are they putting something up on TV about Waco and pushing that idea that, it was this cult? And what do you know about Waco and what really happened there?
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked that, because this is it's one of the things in this book. It's very important to understand the history of false flag attacks and how the shadow government manipulates things. I had some people call me and tell me about that Waco thing on TV you're talking about, and they said, Cody, I think that's in response to you and all the interviews you've been given about what really happened there. And so I'll tell you what I know about that. That occurred on, February 28th of 1993. And that shootout broke out. There were 4 ATF agents dead and 6 Branch Davidians dead at the time. And it ended on April 19th, 2 years before the Murrah building went up in 1993, and there were 54 dead and 21 children included. But what I'm going to tell you is a story that's never been out except by me, and it's about a Branch Davidian named Ron Cole. And Ron Cole told me this stuff straight to my face. And I'm not a Branch Davidian or anything, but at the time in '93, I was the biggest machine gun dealer up here in Colorado. We were buying and selling machine guns and silencers all around the U.S. We worked on DEA and FBI guns. We were doing sealed, no bid, well, they weren't no bid, but sealed contracts for Navy SEALs, developing prototype guns and so forth. We had lathes and blue ink tanks and the whole thing. And one of my primary distributors was in Dallas, Texas, which is RDR Distributors. And the ATF came right after the Branch Davidian compound. A gunfight erupted. Doug, I'm trying to remember his name. I'll remember his name in a minute. He's a guy up in Denver, the ATF field office. He was our compliance. Doug Miller, that's his name. He was our compliance officer out of the ATF office in Denver. he came down to my shop, and he said, I want to see all your books, see what guns have went to Texas. And I said, why? He said, because that Branch Davidian shootout was down there. We're trying to determine what kind of weapons. Have you sold them any machine guns or silencers? And so I showed him all the books and everything, and I said, I've never dealt with them. I deal with RSR in Dallas, not down in Waco. And so Ron Cole was at the Branch Davidian compound. He's a good friend of David Koresh's. And just before this shootout erupted, on February 28th of 93, Ron got a call from his mom down in Florida. She's real sick, old lady, and he flew down there to take care of her. Well, the very next day, this shootout broke out, and he heard something about it preliminarily on the news, so he called David Koresh at the Branch Davidian compound before the feds cut the phone lines. And Koresh had just been in this gunfight and had been shot. But the phone lines were still up, and Ron asked him what happened. And Koresh told him that the ATF pulled up in trucks with cattle trailers behind them, and they were all unmarked. And they pulled out in front of the yard there in front of the front door, and the Branch Davidian compound's dogs went running out there and was barking at them. And the feds just opened up on them and shot the dogs. And then they started shooting at the building. And so Koresh and some of the Branch Davidian guys returned fire, and the gunfight erupted where Koresh was hit. And so Ron Cole, then the phone lines were cut, and Ron Cole left his mother and flew immediately back there to Waco. But by that time, the feds had set their perimeter around the compound, and no one was allowed in or out. So Ron Cole, being a Branch Davidian, he went around and found some of the other Branch Davidians that were not at the compound when it was hit. And they were out shopping and doing stuff in town. Well, they all gathered at the perimeter and set up a camp. And they were watching with binoculars and telescopes, to see what all was going on. And night after night, they were seeing these streaks in the sky. It was, they were red and green and orange, and they didn't know what they were. They were all civilians. None of them had been in the military. And so they were talking one night, standing around there, looking with binoculars, going, what's going on? And we wish we had some night vision. And somebody walked up and said, I have some military night vision. And it was Timothy McVeigh. And he had some military night vision from Desert Storm. And so with that night vision, they could see what was going on. And what was happening, Ron said, was there were black helicopters with no markings whatsoever. They had no lights at all. They were flat black helicopters, and they were circling the Branch Davidian compound at night. And they could see the tracer bullets. They were firing M60 machine guns down into the compound through the roof. And they were abhorred when they saw all this. And they asked McVeigh, why are they doing that? And he said, it's a standard Delta Force tactic or Army tactic. When you have some insurgents that are in a building with a perimeter set around it, standard policy is to deny the high ground to the snipers. In other words, when you start machine gunning up the roof, it presses the shooters all down to the lower levels. When they go to the lower levels, they can't shoot as far. And so you can collapse the perimeter around the building. And he said that's what they're doing. And night after night, they watched them fly over there and machine gunning up those people. And later on, when that supposed fire broke out in April 19th of 93, all those people mostly had already been killed. And they started that fire to burn that compound down to cover up all the murders. And so Ron Cole, seeing all of this, he told me that he and the rest of the Branch Davidians that were out there were afraid the FBI was going to come kill them. And they came up here to Colorado. And they got a little ranch place out in the mountains somewhere, secluded place. And they acquired some illegal MP5 machine guns to protect themselves. Now, I didn't sell them these weapons, but I know a lot of the cops and the dealers and all the people around here in that arms community. And then what Ron Cole told me next was they had been staying there for a week to 10 days, and that a Black Ops FBI team came in there to hit them at night. And a battle broke out, a gunfight, and several of the Branch Davidians were killed there, and he fled out in the woods. And he went up to Canada and he got an Algerian passport, a fake passport, and he was about to leave the next morning and fly to Algiers and disappear forever. And he made one mistake. He called his girlfriend back in Waco to tell her goodbye. He was never going to see her again. And he used a cell phone, which was really stupid. But the next morning, the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the FBI hit the place he was staying, and they arrested him. And they brought him down and threw him in with us. At this time, I had been planted with false evidence and was in the FDC, which is the Federal Detention Center in Inglewood, Colorado. It's a maximum security facility there. And they put Ron Cole in there with us. And he was scared to death. He saw me one day. I had some stuff for my case about the Waco and the Oklahoma City bombing thing. And he started telling me all this stuff. But he was very reclusive and stayed back in his cell and hardly talked to anyone. He told me he's always afraid the FBI was going to kill him. And then one day they came and took him out of there, and I never saw him since. But that's a story that he told me, straight to my face. And it fits with a lot of the cover-up stuff that went on around the Waco. In this book, I have a section on that with a whole lot of documentation and so forth. So that's a basic thing that happened there. Timothy McVeigh was there, and he saw what our government was really doing, and that's one of the things that pissed him off. Another thing that really pissed him off was after he got back from Desert Storm, he'd won a Bronze Star as an M1A1 tank commander and for confirmed kills, and he signed up with Special Forces. He wanted to be a Green Beret. And there was, I think, about 400 people in his class, and they did the standard psych profiles the Army gives you. And one day, the CO and a CIA person pulled him and 10 other guys, about 10 guys out of the class, and offered him recruitment, just like they did me. And they told him he'd be blowing up buildings and moving drugs and assassinating people, all for the CIA, while he was using the front of the Special Forces. So he was to complete his training, be a soldier, and then covertly work for the CIA. That's what they call an OCO, which is an official cover operative. His official cover would be Special Forces soldier, but his true thing would be CIA. Well, McVeigh turned him down, just like I did. And he went up to Calspan in Buffalo, New York, and worked security guard. And there's a whole section in the book about all that. Because Calspan was a big defense contractor. They worked with the Redstone program, with the Air Force. It was a lot of electronic countermeasures and so forth, and high-level stuff like microchips. We know all this because McVeigh wrote his sister Jennifer letters, and I have copies of these letters in the book where he told them all about CIA wanting him to assassinate people and move drugs and all this other stuff. And so we have a lot of documentation about all this. But what a lot of people don't know, Dave, is that when McVeigh was going over to Desert Storm, January 91, he got the standard set of shots. And in these shots, there's the anthrax shots we talked about with the squalene autoimmune adjuncts, which made everyone sick as hell. And he was also part of another program unknowingly. They injected him with a microchip in his buttocks. And this microchip was a test program covertly of the Lockheed Martin Satellite Systems BEAST program. BEAST, that stands for Battle Engagement Area Simulator Tracker. And this was a first-time test of microchip technology in a real-time war situation, with blowing sand and clouds and oil well fires. Saddam had set a lot of those Kuwaiti oil well heads on fire. And so the satellites could see down through all of that and track individual soldiers. They'd had problems with standard dog tags. When you get in a firefight, and arms and legs are blown off the torso, and they have to go around and pick up the body parts and stuff. It was also a test, of implanting these things in the torso and using RDIF to find soldiers that had been wounded or blown up. So McVeigh was a part of this and didn't know it. And then when he got back, the autoimmune protein code on the thing started messing up, and he got sores and all and had it removed. And he was pissed off about being used as a guinea pig, and he was pissed off about being used as a guinea pig with the anthrax shots, and he was also pissed off about what he saw at Waco, what our government was really doing and hiding. And I expect, I don't know for sure, but it was at that point at Calspan, where he was a security guard after he left the Special Forces, that he was approached, to bomb the Murrah building and take the job that I turned down. I don't know who all else they offered that job to. They needed to bomb that building, and they started it in 94. That's when Senator Chris Shays on the Armed Services Committee had ordered FBI to gather all those records. So they knew the records were going to go there, and they didn't want them to show up anywhere, especially at some Senate subcommittee hearing. So they offered McVeigh and maybe some other guys, I don't know, the job. It's a standard program they have where they take an ex-military cutout, who was in a war, all the excitement and adrenaline of a war, and they give him the standard program of alienation and isolation, and you stick him off in some boring security job and say, hey, you want $1 million to go do something, And he was already predisposed to hating the government from all the stuff that he'd seen and what they'd done to him with his chip and all that kind of stuff. So this whole story is in the book, and it's documented with letters, to his sister and various things like that. But it's a story that the mainstream media, Dave, doesn't even put out there. All they put is the lies, the standard goop of lies and disinformation and misdirection to cover up Waco, to cover up Oklahoma City bombing, to cover up Timothy McVeigh. He was executed in record time. He was executed on June the 11th, 2001. They bumped a lot of guys off of death row that, put him up ahead of them at the Terre Haute facility. And I talked to one of the attorneys that held McVeigh's mother's hand. They were sitting on the front row at the death chamber looking through the glass. His name was Nathan Chambers, the attorney, and I talked to him directly a little while after that happened and asked him what it was like. And he just put up his hand over his face, closed his eyes, and put his head down and walked away. Didn't say a word. A lot of people have asked me, Dave, well, we've heard conspiracy theories that McVeigh really wasn't killed, and it was all a front for the CIA, and he was working for him the whole time and all that. I don't know all that stuff. I know what I'm telling you is what I know either myself or from firsthand knowledge and things that we can document, like those letters to his sister Jennifer. And so there are a lot of conspiracy theories that McVeigh never was killed, and the whole thing was a front for the CIA the whole time, and blah, 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 blah. All I know in my book is I try to stick to the facts, and most of the witnesses are like one removed from the actual event, like Ron Cole.
Cody, I wanted to move a little bit forward here, and we know throughout time there's been many false flags. I mean, 9/11, we see all the different shootings like Columbine, Sandy Hook, and things like that. Here we are today with Trump. He's in office, and, we have people saying that this memo is going to be released about the FISA warrants. We have people saying that there's going to be indictments against the Clintons. They're investigating the Uranium One deal. They're investigating the email servers. They're investigating everything about the Clintons, about their foundations. And we see right now that the deep state, we had this, missile warning in Hawaii, which was either there was a missile headed towards Hawaii or it was a test. Do you think the deep state right now, do you think they're finished? Do you think, from your experience and your knowledge, do you think they are ready to do something else? Do you think they're just going to let these investigations and everything come out? Is that how they work?
No. They are about to do something else, I feel very strongly. And you're talking about the Clinton Foundation. A few weeks ago, that Dr. Lorich up in New York, that surgeon, he was involved with the Haiti relief effort down there, and the Clintons were supposed to give $30 million from their foundation, and he was about to testify, and then they said he committed suicide. And it's a long list of people like that, the Clinton death list. We got lists of them in my book, and the listeners can Google up all that stuff of all the people like Vince Foster and all of them Jim McDougal down in Arkansas that end up suicided or having heart attacks or strokes, standard CIA stuff. The deep state is in trouble. People like me and Ole Damagard and other whistleblowers, Edward Snowden, there's a lot of different people, Thomas Drake in the NSA, William Binney, NSA. I talked to Thomas Drake one time. John Kiriakou on the CIA's rendition program. There's more and more whistleblowers, Dave, that are coming forward. The deep state is in trouble because people are waking up now and they're seeing these patterns of these false flag attacks. That's what me and Ole Damagard try to do is correlate individual incidents like this Oklahoma City bombing or 9/11 or Sandy Hook and show people the underlying patterns of media control and information control and how these patterns exist on these false flag events around the world, the Gulf of Tonkin, it goes on and on. And so people are waking up to that, and the more people that wake up to this stuff and stuff on your show that you talk about, I've listened to your show for a long time, and you put out some really good stuff, connecting these big dots with the international bankers, the drugs, the arms, the false flags, Lockheed Martin and all their satellite stuff. All this stuff ties together, but it's a big picture. And we need people like you and me and different people who can put this stuff in perspective for the average person who doesn't have time to do all the research. But this deep state is in trouble. I believe that Donald Trump is trying his best to drain the swamp like he said in his campaign. I believe he's encountered a lot of serious, deep resistance. And I know there's a whole lot of stuff going on that we don't know about, and we don't have actionable intelligence. I try to stick to facts or verifiable facts or documentation, but the problem is, Dave, as you well know, when it gets to the deep state and all these hidden indictments and hidden email servers and all this stuff, it is so difficult to get get the facts we need. And so there's a lot of things that swirl around. And I'd like to tell you what I know about Libya, what really happened over there, because it points directly to this. I don't know how much time we have.
Yeah, go ahead. That's fine.
So, yeah, this is an example of how the information is manipulated. I had an associate, I will not use his name because he's still active, but he had been in the U.S. Marine Corps and got out of that, and then was a contractor for CIA. And he was over there in Benghazi and had gotten in a firefight that night that all that stuff happened. And the basic story he told me, he signed point-specific non-disclosure agreements, which is standard, and can't talk in public. But he whispered this stuff straight into my ear. And he said he was there, and they were sitting around at the compound. And previous to all that, when we went over there and kicked Gaddafi out of power, Muammar Gaddafi, I once had another CIA associate who had dinner with Gaddafi in his presidential palace in Tripoli, Libya there. And so he told me a bunch of stuff about Gaddafi. And then what had happened was Gaddafi had a whole bunch of gold bullion and a whole bunch of Russian arms. He'd been taking his oil revenue for years in Libya and buying gold and buying arms. And when we went over there and he was killed, and, remember Hillary Clinton said, we came, we saw, he died. Well, what my associate told me was that President Obama, the U.S. President, and Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, were in a covert scheme to loot that gold bullion, and they did steal it, and then they were taking the arms and funneling them through Benghazi over to ISIS, and that ISIS was a proxy army for the U.S. deep state, and that they were arming them with the stolen arms they had confiscated from Gaddafi. All this was done without the American people's knowledge. So on the night that firefight broke out, insurgents had come to that compound they were really mad that the U.S. was over there arming ISIS, and ISIS was running around tearing hell out of everything and destroying the old Roman ruins and murdering and doing looting, and they were trying to stop the arms flow that Obama and Clinton were secretly sending to ISIS. And so that's why they hit that compound, because all that stuff was going through that compound. That was a front. And he said he was sitting in his quarters, and they had radio comms, and they got the call that a firefighter had broken out, and there were air assets. And he was ordered 3 separate times, Dave, to stand down. And he had taken an oath as a Marine Corps, in the Marine Corps, you know, for the Constitution. And he told me that he couldn't stand it anymore. And he said his contract be damned and all of his stuff be damned, and he was just going to go help those Navy SEALs and the guys at our compound. And so he went and engaged in that firefight. And he said that the insurgents blew off the top of the roof first thing with the Soviet mortars. And that's just like the Branch Davidian compound. The first thing you do is deny the high ground. Then you can collapse the perimeter around the structure. And that's what they did, and a firefight got in, and those Navy SEALs were killed, and the ambassador was killed there, and that the air assets that were available were all ordered to be stood down. And he said that Hillary Clinton was a traitor, and they deliberately held back the assets and let that embassy be destroyed so it would destroy all the evidence of their covert arms going to ISIS and the gold bullion and all the stuff that was going on. And he said that Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, if all the data and the facts would be known to the American people, that they were in fact guilty of a conspiracy to commit treason against the United States. And that's what he told me straight to in my ear. And that's a story that very few Americans have heard. He also told me that when our air assets off our aircraft carriers, I had some friends in the Navy that worked on the USS Saratoga, but some of our air assets were sent. You remember, Dave, when they had those big long lines of Toyota trucks out in the desert?
Yeah.
Okay. You can't tell me that pilots can't see ISIS trucks lined up in the desert. In Vietnam, they had jungle canopy to hide under. But out in the desert, you have clear visibility. There's plenty of sunshine. And these guys had orders. They would go in and they'd call in to get the green light to fire on these ISIS convoys, and then they were being told to stand down. And they would come back to the carriers, and it's standard policy to drop the ordnance in the ocean before landing on the carrier deck because for fires and so forth. So they would drop their ordnance in the water. Then when they landed, the pilots all started bitching and saying, "Oh man, we had a clear sight. Why were we ordered to stand down?" And then they had to sign point-specific national security agreements and stuff not to ever talk about it. And so what my buddy told me was that the stuff they showed over here to us Americans in our news, where they showed those pictures of the ISIS facilities and convoys being blown up, what they did was they took Russian wing camera photos and videos when the Russians were really hitting ISIS. They took those pictures and photos and substituted them for ours and showed them to us Americans over here saying, "Look, we're hitting ISIS." The whole time we were protecting ISIS, and the whole time we were arming ISIS. And that gold bullion, I don't know the amount. My buddy didn't know the amount. He said that it was rumored around there's a lot of it around there, and Gaddafi had security around it. Nobody knows what happened to all that gold. There's no telling what it went to do. Maybe finance ISIS, the proxy army, to overthrow Assad. The Saudis wanted that big pipeline to go through there, and Assad said no. So nobody knows where this gold went, and the arms, everything was destroyed when that compound was destroyed when the ambassador was murdered. So the whole thing was covered up. And I hope one day that the truth will come out. I hope that our Navy SEALs, our veterans, and our ambassador did not die in vain for some dark political agenda and cover-up. But the deep state operates like this, and the political criminals that are in power at the time, like Obama's and the Bush's, the Clintons, that this is run-of-the-mill stuff for them. And then they doctor up through the media control over here, and we never hear the truth. We only get little glimpses and pieces covered over with a whole bunch of propaganda.
Cody, I agree with you. I mean, that's what we hear here, propaganda. And I really want to thank you for coming on the X-22 Report Spotlight. How can people get a hold of your book?
Yeah, the book's Choosing the Light, Dark Secrets of the Oklahoma City Bombing. And we have one website in Europe. It's lightonconspiracies.com/Cody. You can get the book there, and then we have another one here in the U.S. It's real simple. It's CodySnodgrass.com. That's CodySnodgres.com. And so we have the books available there. There's a whole lot of information in this book that we haven't covered.
Cody, once again, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much for being on the Spotlight.
Yes, sir.